Novomykhailivka is a small town of no particular importance in southeastern Ukraine, but it appears to have become the most contested spot on the entire battlefield, and it's becoming a proving ground for both Russia and Ukraine. We're going to talk about why, who's fighting, and how the battle is going for each side. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's get into it. Okay, first, Novomykhailivka is at an interesting location on the front line in general. You can see here that it is occupying an interesting spot just south of the town of Marinka. This is a heavily contested town that recently fell entirely into Russian control. So when you look south, you can see here is the town itself, Novomykhailivka. And what's also interesting is that it sits on the border between the Donbas region and Zaporizhzhia province or oblast. And what's interesting about that is that Zaporizhzhia is the population is much more pro-Ukrainian. The terrain is much more open. And in contrast to the Donbas has been under Russian occupation since 2014. In contrast, Zaporizhzhia is only occupied as part of this Russian invasion 2 years ago. And so this location is significant in the sense that it can be a fortification, for lack of a better term, between these two crucial oblasts. Again, you can literally see on the map here the 2014 Russian occupied region and the more recently occupied area. So for Russia, they probably are looking at this town. What I think their overall objective is to take this town because, one, it will help them shore up and stabilize the situation for them in Marinka. Marinka here in the north is not that far away from Novomykhailivka. Let's see if we can get the actual distance here. You can see it's about 10 kilometers away. That's an easy artillery fire mission. And in fact, depending on where exactly the front lines fall, you might even be able to reach them with mortars if you stretch. And so for Russia, they want to see this secured because it makes their recently seized town of Marinka more vulnerable, at least as while it's under Ukrainian control. But I think Russia's other objective, you can see that in terms of developed areas, that Novomykhailivka is a stepping stone that would enable Russia to move on to towns like Pereskoivka, Kostiantynivka, and none of these towns are of any substantive size, but taken collectively, you can see how if you can get a foothold into these urban regions, it's pretty easy for you to flip town after town, and if left unchecked, it could result in a string of Russian victories, which Russia needs not just for military value, because none of these towns are large enough to particularly warrant being a strong military strong point, and they're not along any key avenues of approach, but as a symbolic or propaganda victory. Putin really needs this. He's going into his election, and while the elections in Russia are a farce, it's important for Putin to receive a strong mandate, and it's an opportunity for Putin to tout to the public his accomplishments over the course of the last 4 years. And Putin, more than anyone, needs to prove to his people that this immensely costly war has been worth it. Bear in mind, the current estimates are that Russia has lost more troops in this war than in all the wars that the Soviet Union has fought post-World War II combined. More than Chechnya, more than 10 years in Afghanistan. So Putin really needs to show some wins. And it seems like he and the Kremlin have fixated on this town. Now, in contrast, you have Ukraine, and Ukraine's objective in maintaining its hold on Novomykhailivka is that, as we talked about, they don't want to see a string of towns fall to Russian forces. They also want to maintain the ability to put pressure onto Marinka, but I think the number one reason that Ukraine is holding this town so strongly is simply that it's a great opportunity for them. The Russian forces, it's this really, really difficult terrain to conduct offensive actions on, as discussed, right? There's a very dense, difficult to maneuver terrain in the Donbas region, where Zaporizhzhia is much more open. And so I think this town is the surrounding terrain is open. And for Ukraine, they say, we want Russia to fight us here because it provides us such an opportunity to inflict massive casualties. And we'll talk exactly here in a minute about how they're doing that. Okay, so you can see when I pivot over to the other map that the lines look very different. And I think the reason is because, one, a lot of this open ground, nobody actually is trying to control it because it's so vulnerable. And two, the whole area surrounding this town is so heavily contested that I think even military mappers have a hard time delineating who controls what and where. So here's the signs of the fight, so to speak. On the Ukrainian side, my research has pinned the 79th Air Assault Brigade. Now, this is a air mobile regiment. Classically, air mobile regiments are helicopter insertion units. But, of course, due to the extreme danger that basically anything that flies incurs in this battlefield, it's become more of a mechanized brigade. So you have the 79th, and what they seem to be doing here is following the Battle of Marinka, which came to a culmination a few weeks ago. The brigade seemed to have shifted its focus to the defense of Novomykhailivka, and they have pivoted to have a much more mechanized task organization. But what I think is more significant is that they have become very, very proficient at drones, at drone-enabled warfare. And on the other side, of course, is the 39th Separate Guards Brigade of the Russian military. This is interesting because, one, it is a Russian military formation. It's not from the separatist DPR or LPR. It's a true Red Army unit, and it is considered one of the most storied units in the Russian military, having served back to at least 1932, and was actually originally slated to deploy to Syria and then got diverted in the war in Ukraine when Putin invaded. So what you have is two very seasoned units, right? The 79th Air Assault Brigade, this isn't on Ukrainian side, this isn't one of those brigades that they cobbled together for the counteroffensive. These guys fought at the Battle of the Donbas or the Donetsk airport in 2014. They have existed. They were actually a Ukrainian brigade under the Soviet Union. So these are Ukraine's finest. So whenever you have these two storied units go head to head, like we're seeing here, you're going to have a much higher level of aggression. You're going to have a much higher level of weapons proficiency. You're likely going to have even just like some reputational defenses, right? The 39th and the 79th, they want to be able to say, hey, we took out a top tier unit on the other side. And so the strategy both units are employing is pretty unique. For Russia, and I can't show you the footage, I just apologize, the 39th is relying on these small salami slice type offensive actions. The reason is because thanks to Ukrainian mining, that they have to advance through these roads that approach the town. And the number one approach they seem to be using is the 531 highway that runs north-south here. Let's zoom in. And you can see, you probably already have identified the problem here. First off, if you want to launch an offensive action, the nearest staging area is going to be this Russian-controlled town of Solodky. And once the Russian forces consolidate, they seem to be establishing formations between 4 and 10 armored vehicles, and then they are moving them, right? Here's the 39th Guards in Solodky. They seem to be advancing them straight towards Novomykhailivka, right? They can't really go off on either side of this open terrain because of Ukrainian scatterable mines that have been deployed. And so they really have one option, which is to throw these troops, to drive them it looks like about 7 kilometers down this straight roadway with no cover. And again, I can't show you the photos or the videos that I've seen, but it looks like there are between, I'm going to say around at least 10 confirmed, probably more vehicles that have been destroyed along this route. But Russia just keeps sending these small groups to try to get to this region here, this area. And these set of buildings are actually a church, believe it or not, which is why some people are calling this the Battle of Faith. And interestingly, the church sort of is, despite heavy shelling, the steeple of the church is still standing. So there's starting to be kind of rumors, for lack of a better term, that it's some kind of battlefield miracle that this Ukrainian church is still standing despite tremendous Russian shelling. And so these 39th Guards or 39th Guards units try to get to these buildings, try to push the Ukrainians out. The problem is, of course, the 79th has their own strategy. And for them, they are likely much closer. They're probably in the town of Novomykolivka. And what they are doing is, because this terrain is so open, their drones are able to conduct really good drone surveillance. They, I suspect, are able to observe Russian forces probably before they leave the town of Solodke and watch them progress down this village, down this 531 highway. And what seems to be happening is that Ukrainian forces will see this attack coming. They will deploy what looks like either scatterable mines, or they may even have teams of soldiers themselves go out in the evening, in the dusk, and place anti-tank mines. And then the mechanized forces of the 39th will drive over them, hit them. And then once the convoy is stalled, that's when the 79th runs artillery missions in order to take out the remaining vehicles. And it seems to be highly effective because while we see occasionally, I'll take you guys back through time, watch the Russian front line here as we move back through time. You can see Russian forces sometimes get into these regions, but they just can't seem to hold it, right? And you can see that Russian forces are sort of making progress. For example, they appear to have kicked out the 79th defenders from this windbreak here, but in exchange for this relatively limited progress, they have incurred a pretty tremendous amount of casualties. Now, bear in mind, guys, that the current status of this battle is ongoing, and as we work back through time, you can see that while there's routine Ukrainian counterattacks, the pressure that the 39th is putting onto the 79th Air Assault Brigade is just unrelenting, right? There's always, despite destroying what appear to be dozens of Russian vehicles, the 39th just gets more and more vehicles and more troops to throw at the Ukrainians. And so as a result, Ukrainians will take these forces out, push them out of this churchyard, and then the 39th will just go back. They'll load up another round of vehicles, another round of troops, and push them into the enemy. It's really, there's some pretty crazy footage. And if you're interested, again, I can't show it here. It's on my premium site, Combat Vet News. Let me pull it up. So what I do is I find the viral footage from these sort of heavy fighting areas in a given week, and I do a deep dive analysis, right? We're going to look at some of the tactics. Coming up on Tuesday, we're going to look at one of the units from the 39th who's conducting one of these assaults, and it is so amateurish, guys. It is like something out of the Second World War. But Russia can afford to do it, right? These soldiers don't have to be highly effective. That's what kind of scares me, for lack of a better term, about this fighting, is that, the 79th is, by most accounts, shredding Russian artillery, shredding Russian vehicles, shredding Russians, and they just keep coming. So Anyway, guys, that's all I had for you. Be sure to, again, check us out, combatvetnews.com, become a member, support the channel. You know, there's basically at this point no sponsors that will touch me. I can't even get half these videos monetized. So your support is literally the thing that allows me to do this. So thanks to our Colonel tier members, our Lieutenant tier members. You can always hit like and subscribe on the video. Let the YouTube algorithm know I'm making good content, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.